Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Edwin Raymond. He is a whistleblower and a former lieutenant of the NYPD, author of An Inconvenient Cop, My Fight to Change Policing in America, which he co-authored with Jon Sternfeld. Welcome to the program, Edwin.
Thanks for having me, both you and Emma.
Let's start with just like, because this is part memoir and then sort of a part policy analysis and in some respects prescriptive. But let's just start with, growing up in Brooklyn and your how you ended up becoming a cop.
Yeah. Well, I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, in a very different New York, just a very different nation. My parents were immigrants from Haiti. At age of 3, unfortunately, I lost my mom. She died of cancer. My dad struggled. He didn't speak English, didn't have much of an education. So it was a rough childhood when you mix with the realities of certain urban areas. But despite this, I walked a very straight line, which unfortunately did not stop police harassment, which started around the age of 15. So after about 3 years of being harassed by police, not just me, but colleagues, when I was in high school, many times at the cafeteria table, we'd discuss what our experiences with the NYPD. And I went to high school in Manhattan, and the school had students from all 5 boroughs. And all 5 boroughs, we would sit in the cafeteria and discuss what we experienced, going to school, coming from school, on the weekends with cops. So at 18, after about 3 years of this experience, I made a decision that people thought was crazy at the time. I said, I'm going to join the police department, which I ended up doing at 22 years old.
All right. So I want to just give us a little bit of a sense. And this is during, so this is Giuliani era. And right,
Yes.
when you're 18 or, at 15, 16, 17, you're in high school. You go into, one of the high schools you got to travel to in the city. So you're out of district, but everybody else is coming from different districts too. So, and like you say, all 5 boroughs, but give people like an idea of what that means. You're a 15-year-old. I'm just known as a parent of a former high school kid in New York City. If you're going to one of the schools in Manhattan, you're doing well in terms of your grades. Because you're going to like an all citywide school. And so it's completely divorced from the life you're leading at that point. What is it that you're dealing with as a 15-year-old? Because I've had a 15-year-old in this city, and she didn't have any issues with the cops ever because she's a white kid. I mean, that's, and maybe, and to some extent, maybe also because she's a girl or was, but tell us your experience.
Yeah. So I actually started working at a very young age, which, I'm thankful for because, again, I grew up in a very, my household, we just didn't have much. So working, it taught me different disciplines and it allowed me to earn honest money. But going to and coming from work, I would get stop and frisk. The cops would stop me. Sometimes they'd question. They'd always be rude. And before you know it, they're searching my pockets illegally, which I didn't really understand at the time was illegal. I was only 15. And this would happen weekly in some capacity, whether I'm in the city, in the subway, walking the streets of Flatbush, Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn. And I just didn't get it. Again, I grew up in a very rough environment. So I knew that things occurred where we need public safety. We need officers. We need something to address the violence and other things that are going on. But because I wasn't personally involved in any of it, I didn't understand why I was getting this treatment from cops. But that was the main thing. Stop and frisk, stop, question, and frisk, as the NYPD used to call it. And what I didn't know, what I would end up learning after the police academy, because even in the police academy, I still couldn't pinpoint why certain minority groups experience that type of detrimental policing. And day one in the police academy, Sam and Emma, we got quotas, right? And the quotas came in a trifecta. There were arrests, summonses, and stop and frisk. So every 28-day period, every month, each officer would have a minimum that they had to hit. 10, my numbers were 4, 10, and 10. 4 arrests, 10 summonses, and 10 stop and frisk every month. And that was bare minimum. If you didn't get that, you would be reprimanded, et cetera. And, I start replaying my own experiences. And most importantly, I start watching my colleagues who I had gotten to know for 6 months in the police academy. I knew they weren't, as individuals, necessarily bad people, but I watched how they patrolled, how they policed because of that pressure for those numbers.
And how was that? What was that experience like? I mean, going through what you did as a young teenager, being searched when you weren't doing anything wrong. Like, how did you get from that point to wanting to be a police officer? Like, what was your internal dialogue like, even though obviously your interactions with police were not good?
For some reason, despite those negative encounters, I didn't paint police with a broad brush. And I think that's what helped me know that, joining wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing. Also, a family friend who's like an uncle to me, I ran into him at around 17, 18 years old. I ran into him, I hadn't seen him in years and didn't know that he had become a police officer. So seeing him in the uniform as someone that I personally know and someone that not someone to fear, that also helped a lot. But honestly, it's one of those things where if you want to understand how something operates, you have to go into it. You have to do the research. So at 22, I joined to analyze the police department from within to see exactly what buttons need to be pushed so we can move the needle in the right direction. When I think about it now, it's kind of crazy as an 18-year-old to be thinking that way, but that's what it was.
Yeah, it's impressive. It does sound a little bit crazy. Like, I wonder how, your friends who went through these same things when they were kids, did they what was the range of reactions? Like, what does it? I'm curious. I think you're a unique case where, despite that type of harassment on a weekly basis, your first thought is, or your most prominent thought is, I want to go in and change that system. I would imagine a lot of other people are like, I completely get a lot more cynical about the whole thing.
And you're absolutely right, Sam. There were times where, because I still live in East Flatbush, but I'm a little further west. There were times where I visit the block I was born and raised on, and within 5 minutes, no one's outside. Everybody would clear out because they thought I lost my, they thought I lost my mind. But again, it's just one of those things where you're never really going to understand how something operates if you don't research it yourself. So the reaction of my peers at the time was definitely cynical, after police and things that we hear and know and see all the time. But thankfully, it wasn't mine. It wasn't mine. And, what I was able to learn in the last 15 years, I think it's crucial. I think it's what's been missing from the conversation, honestly. When you think about the argument, right, it's very polarizing. Either cops can do no wrong or cops need not exist. But one voice that's been missing from this conversation, it's the voice of justice-minded law enforcement officers. And to some people, it's an oxymoron because they see this, they're so cynical when it comes to the system. If you're a member, then you can't possibly be justice-minded. But we exist. Not all of us are whistleblowers. Some of us need softer landings. But there are police officers all throughout the nation. In the 7 years that I've been an activist, over 2,000 police officers have reached out seeking guidance. Some of them have started their own lawsuits. Many of them inspired by what they see myself and the rest. It's a group of us called the NYPD 12, of which I'm the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit. Many other police departments, many other police officers have been inspired. At first, they thought we were crazy, but then when they would go back to work, it'd be harder for them to say no. It'd be harder for them to look away from what they were seeing. And I think this is a voice that's absolutely needed. And obviously, as an author, I'm able to get on a platform like this, which I'm thankful for. But as a society, I think we need to really open up our ears and minds to the idea that officers from within who can still see the detriments are the people that we need in the room.
All right. Well, let's back up and so you get into the academy. You realize that there's quotas on these things. The police department the NYPD more often not deny that there was quotas. Like, how was that communicated in a way that, you know, if everybody in your police academy is getting these quotas, it feels like that would be a tough thing to sort of hide, or to be able to deny. How did that all work?
So the NYPD and many police departments, they have their press folks, right? Their internal press folks. And essentially the culture is what we say to the press and what we say to you are two different things. Don't focus on what we say to the press, and do what you're told at roll call. So they have to deny it because it's unlawful. Throughout the nation, I believe every municipality has outlawed quotas in policing, in law enforcement. So they cannot ever admit that this thing is real. But this is how the police department operates and functions. And this is what has spread from New York to other parts of the nation. They don't expect people to speak out, right? This is why they can hide it, because, you know, there's 54,000 employees in the New York City Police Department. So imagine having 54,000 people and barely anyone says something. Part of it is just the paramilitary structure of the police department. Everything, it's like the military. Everything is ranked. So if you're not in a rank and you don't have authority, you're technically not supposed to speak out. I've taken the risk. One, I'm still a private citizen that can use my First Amendment. But when I go back to work, you better believe retaliation is waiting for me.
All right. Well, so let's talk about what your career up until, you know, like walk through your career as you get in, because you actually rose pretty relatively quickly, I guess. I don't know, through the ranks. But what did you tell us about that, and then and what you saw, you know, with stop and frisk on the other side, I guess.
Yeah. So in the beginning, I spoke out internally, right? Because I realized many of my colleagues, they didn't sign up to change the system. They signed up because they needed a job. They're not thinking about these things deeper. But as human beings, we tend to rationalize our behavior. So I would press my colleagues and say, hey, what do you think about this policy? This isn't right. Technically, this is unconstitutional. And sometimes they would engage, many times they wouldn't. But it would start to piss off the leadership, right? Because me asking these questions, they don't want subordinates asking these questions, because they need you to get your numbers, because it's a reflection on your supervisor, which is a reflection on his supervisor, so on and so on, all the way up to the mayor's office. So I spoke out internally first. Again, it landed me in retaliation, and I was ostracized. But so again, 7 years ago, I joined other officers in what we hope would be a class action lawsuit to finally get rid of these quotas and the discrimination in the policies that the leadership comes up with. And so it started off internally. Let's
walk up to that. Yeah. But when you were talking, like, were you talking to your fellow cops? Were you talking to your commanding officer? And I'm curious, like, were cops who came from, let's say, your neighborhood in Brooklyn, or, you know, in the Bronx, or, you know, cops who grew up with this, were they more sensitive to this? Was there a difference between, you say this to a black cop or to a white cop? Was there, give me the range of responses you had, and then let's talk about what led up to the lawsuit. But we'll get to that in a second.
Actually, great questions. At first, I spoke to peers because, again, paramilitary organization is something called the chain of command. I literally can't just go and speak to the commander. The commander can always speak to me, but if I have to get a message to the commander, I'm supposed to get it to my sergeant, who gets it to the lieutenant, etc. But I can speak to my sergeant. But the way I would still find ways to speak with the commander is because I refused to comply, the commander would call me into the office, and that's how I would share these perspectives and challenges and critiques with the commander. But it started off just speaking to peers in the same rank, and my sergeant would either be within earshot, or if my sergeant was to question me about why I'm not consistently meeting the quotas, that's when I essentially found my footing to make my point.
Okay. And then, and so you're not getting you're performing well. but you're not getting any of the promotions that, someone with your record would have gotten. And at that
Well,
point, go ahead.
no, I'm saying, well, according to them, I'm not performing well because I'm not consistently meeting the quota.
Okay.
And in the NYPD, promotions come with civil service exams. So when the time came and I aced the exam, I was supposed to be promoted, but they actually stopped the promotion. They blocked it. But I'll wait for you to get there.
Well, is that the point where you decided like, I got to record some of this because it's not going to, nobody's going to believe me? Or, I mean, and what was your thinking at that moment where you decided to start recording?
So I actually studied the stop, question, and frisk trial in 2013. Every day while that trial was going on, I read the notes, I read the judge's opinion, etc. And I saw the test of both depositions and testimony from the leadership, and I realized that they have absolutely no problem lying to the public under oath. That's when I said, if I don't capture this, I won't. Not knowing exactly what was going to happen, but I remember thinking I need to capture this because if they come for me, if they come for my career, I need to be able to prove what's being said, what's happening, and that's where the decision to record was made. Also, another officer named Adrian Schoolcraft, he had recorded, and they threw him in a psych ward. If he didn't have those recordings, Sam and Emma, his entire story would have been interpreted differently because, they tried to paint him as someone that was crazy. But because he had the recordings, he was able to defend himself and show, no, this is retaliation because of what I'm exposing.
So you're recording not because you're necessarily anticipating a broader attempt at reform of the NYPD, but you're almost halfway to your pension at that point. And I guess you're like 7 years in at that point, you're thinking, or at least a third of the way, you're thinking, I don't want this. I don't want to lose my career here. And this is sort of just like an insurance policy. At what point so you have this recording where they're clearly talking about quotas. What else was on those recordings that ultimately became important for your whistleblowing?
Well, the fact that I was definitely being retaliated against because of not meeting the quotas, and probably the most important thing, the foundation of the lawsuit, the fact that the quotas are expected to be met on minorities. You're not supposed to give these summonses and arrests and stop and frisk. That you're not supposed to do it when it's white folks that are involved. This is something that is exclusive, almost entirely exclusive for minorities. This is how we treat Black and brown folks, particularly in certain neighborhoods, but certain even white residential areas with transient populations. If there's a commercial strip where minorities will probably be working, etc., that's the population that you're expected to meet the quota on. That was crucial to be captured in the recordings. The fact that this is not, when we say this is discrimination, it's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, it's the truth.
Can you give us an example or two of how that expectation was made clear?
Well, a commander in 2015, if you issued a summons to someone who was white, you had to come into his office and explain why you were going for what he called soft targets, right? He wanted you to meet your quota on hard targets, which were people that look like me. Blatant, like just blatant. There was an officer named Michael Birch who is Hispanic, white passing, and that same commander was a lot more comfortable in telling him, you need to target male Blacks and male Hispanics. That same commander, even with me, shockingly, was comfortable enough to say that for the same things that we arrest Black and brown folks, we shouldn't arrest Asian and white folks. And I couldn't believe he said it with me in the room, but he said it in his own words, it wouldn't fly to arrest an Asian woman for something that we arrest a young Black male for.
And
it's almost unbelievable. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly, like, I don't know, on the nose, I guess. But what what is there? Is there like a rationalization for that, or is it like, I mean, what do they? Because it reminds you say that that look like you. That was what one of your instructors at the police academy said to you, that the NYPD, and this is, I guess, in early 90s, is starting to look like the perpetrators, which was basically his way of saying, like, we're now letting black people on the force, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that, the irony in that is he meant well, right? It was about implicit bias. He was trying to let us know to not become victims of implicit bias. And specifically what he said was, when we're out there, if we see a black, or in his words, a Spanish guy with a gun, don't just pull out your gun and start shooting. Find cover, yell out some commands, because the department is becoming more and more diverse. We're starting to look more and more like perps. So while trying to warn us about implicit bias, he used implicit bias. And, that's to show you how implicit it is. But to answer the first part of the question, this type of treatment is in academia, it's called reasonable racism, right? Or rational discrimination. The idea that because Blacks and Hispanics in certain cities are overwhelmingly overrepresented when it comes to certain violent crimes, that it's justified to treat the entire demographic as suspicious. But that's discrimination 101. Because the people, be it black or brown, that are involved in this violence, it's still just a smidgen of the entire population of black and brown people. So it just doesn't make sense to treat an entire demographic this way. But when you dissect the policies, that's what's at the foundation of a lot of it. Is it on purpose? Is it implicit? That's up, for question. But that's where it becomes systemic racism, because despite of how certain policies are written on the face, the expectation is that this treatment is for black and brown folks.
And is there amongst any of the people who sort of buy into that notion that it's reasonable to be discriminatory in this way? Let's put aside whatever is in their head in terms of it's easy for them to do because they may have already some strong racist inclinations or whatnot. But just in terms of, like, based on that, how much of a goes into the calculation of we are criminalizing an entire group of people, despite the fact that, with the intent of finding a much smaller group of people embedded within those people? How much of that sort of like notion of what's the cost associated with, focusing our policing specifically targeted at this demographic?
Honestly, Sam, I don't think it ever crosses their minds. I think they're so hyper-focused on the end goal that they don't care about the way we get there, which is why they're willing to come up with unconstitutional policy. And this is part of the dehumanizing of certain groups, because I've watched officers, the most callous officers, when we're in other neighborhoods, be it for a parade or something else, and they're dealing with different demographics, a complete other side of them comes out. All of a sudden, the callous enforcer isn't there. And I realize what they're able to do is they can relate to these other folks more. And that's why they get more of a human response, not this, robotic, ones and zeros, just hyper-focused on technicalities, etc., petty arrests and innocuous infractions. That's what's been missing from the policy, the human aspect of it. Because, again, they're just not able to relate. And even though police departments, because what they'll say is this is the most diverse the police force has ever been. But something I always challenge is cosmetic diversity, versus diversity of thought. Because honestly, I don't care if an entire police force is white. If I'm being treated, like a human being, and I'm not being violated and harassed and racially profiled, I'll be fine with that. Now, granted, there should be job opportunities for others if they so wish to join law enforcement. But the idea that just because we have Black and brown folks, women, folks who are part of the LGBTQ community in uniform, that the department is all of a sudden no longer engaging in discrimination, it's foolish because they don't sit down with those respective groups and say, traditionally, this is how we've been detrimental to these groups. What can we do better? They don't do that part. It's just be happy that you are of that community and we gave you a job.
So, okay, so you've got these recordings where it's clear that your career is being inhibited by the fact that you won't do something that at that juncture, or maybe a little bit later, has been found to be unconstitutional, or I should say, has been found to be unconstitutional, but is supposedly not happening in the police department. At what point do you decide to join this class action suit, and who are your co-plaintiffs?
Yeah, so it's around March of 2015. I attended a press conference where some of the other officers were exposing evidence to make it clear that there were quotas in a particular precinct, and the lawyers were there. I spoke to the lawyers. I said, "Hey, I have some ammunition that can help this fight," referring to the recordings. But after we met, he then asked me to be the lead plaintiff, which at first I was hesitant to do because that's not what that wasn't the reason that I wanted to meet with him. But, I spoke to some mentors and supporters, and after that I signed on, became the lead plaintiff. And yeah, there were a few other plaintiffs that were signed up to join the lawsuit. It became 12 of us all together. That in the media we've been referred to as the NYPD 12.
And so what was the specific thing that you were suing about as a class? Like was the all people who had been inhibited from rising in their careers within the police department? Is that what the nature of it was?
Well, yeah. So it was 12 of us, all of us black and brown. We all faced retaliation that, so the quota was expected of all police officers, but when it came time for retaliation, black and brown cops got it the worst. And that was the discriminatory part. Also, our First Amendment, once we become whistleblowers, once we use our voice and exercise our First Amendment, we shouldn't face retaliation from the government, which, we're government employees. So, we're facing retaliation. And then the 14th Amendment, which is, equal protection, because we're policing so differently in different parts of the city and we're being reprimanded for not doing that. These are all things that were made up the entire lawsuit.
Where was your union? Like, did you guys ever go to your union? My perspective on the police union is a little bit jaundiced in this way. What was the union response?
Great question, because technically when 11 members, one was a detective, that's a different union. When 11 members of your union take a public stance like this, you don't have a choice as a union. You shouldn't have a choice as to whether or not you're going to support them. Unfortunately, and this is where the culture of policing, particularly the parallels with the Cosa Nostra, this is where this comes in. We were seen as rats, right, as snitches. So it would actually hurt, the optics of supporting us would hurt the union boss, because within the culture of the blue wall of the police, he'd be supporting rats. And that's the reason why behind the scenes, he said, once this thing goes to court and, we're subpoenaed, it is what it is. But to take initiative to support us, that would make them essentially rats for supporting rats. So unfortunately, the union was not there the way they were supposed to be because of the mafioso culture of the NYPD.
And what was ultimately the outcome of the lawsuit?
I hate to say this, but in July of last year, it took 7 years for the judge to make a decision, but she essentially dismissed it from her courtroom. But we've since refiled in state court, and the department tried to get it dismissed, which the judge denied. But then they filed for summary judgment, essentially, one last attempt to get it dismissed. And I think as soon as next week the judge makes a decision, we have obviously submitted rebuttals. The judge is going to go through everything, check the case law, everything we reference, and we find out whether or not we move forward with trial in probably about a week. So it's been over 8 years. There are people who have started this fight, fellow activists who are no longer here with us, like some of them passed from COVID, etc. It's been a long journey, and unfortunately, we're still here. So the case goes on 8 years later.
So what has been the treatment that you've experienced at the police department over those years? Are you still active duty, or are you on what's your status, and what's the treatment been like?
Yeah, so in order to amplify my voice, I made a very difficult decision, and I did an early retirement about 5 months ago. So for the past 5 months, I left the police department because I believe everything that I could accomplish from within, I think I've reached. And being that so many police officers reach out to me when they need guidance, I realize there's a space for me to do more. You know, I'm still building it out, but there's space for me to do more. The first part of your question, I'm sorry, kind of.
What was the treatment like up until when you left the force?
Yeah. So the first thing, that I did not expect was support. I didn't expect for that. I didn't prepare for that. I prepared to be called a rat, a snitch, everything that I understand about the culture. Obviously, that still happened, but there was a lot of support, also a lot of silent support. So essentially, officers are either indifferent, they just go in, do their overtime, go home. They don't care about the politics and the policies. Whatever way that the wind blows, they'll go. There are others that see me as a rat, a snitch, even they call me racist, you name it. Private Facebook groups, private websites, I've seen it all. And then there's a faction of officers who actually support. They're not willing to risk their careers and come forward, but they support silently, and they wish, they hope that I'm successful because they don't agree with the way that things operate. They want to see a change. It's just not easy to risk your career like this.
Tell us a little bit about CompStat, and also I'm unclear. You were assigned to the transit authority too, right? And
Yes.
you recount, that the policing that you would do at one point involved basically hiding, waiting for someone to commit some type of like small infraction, whether it was turnstile jumping or I don't know, litter on the thing, going and arresting them as basically a fishing expedition, as opposed to just standing, in the subway station and inhibiting people from jumping the turnstile or littering or whatnot, just encouraging people to not do these small infractions rather than ruining someone's life in many respects for in levying the fines and the arrests.
Yeah, you said it. CompStat is what exacerbates this, because in the 90s, when CompStat becomes a thing, it's essentially weekly meetings.
Explain what it is for people who don't know.
Sure. So essentially, what CompStat did, which, the first part of it I think is brilliant, it monitored hotspots where violent crimes are taking place. And then it then held the commanders responsible to have a response to these hotspots. Where the problem is, where the cancer comes in, is what it deems as an acceptable response. If you simply increase enforcement activity in areas that are hotspots, you're seen as addressing the condition. And what that means is broken windows enforcement, just minor infractions. If someone gets robbed or stabbed or killed, unfortunately, in a particular place, and then there's an increase in summonses for jaywalking, littering, open container, bike on sidewalk, that commander will be deemed as addressing the homicide or the assault or the robbery, which doesn't make sense, but that's how CompStat operates. It first, it tracks where violent crime is taking place, and then it expects the leadership expects the commander to have a response, and this is where stop and frisk come in. So if there's a robbery, we don't actually solve the case, but we increase stop and frisk within the vicinity of that robbery. That's seen as an acceptable response to the crime, and it's just chasing numbers for numbers' sake. And this is where, after the academy, when I was a transit cop working in the subways, we had to get 4 arrests, 10 summonses, 10 stop and frisks. And the way we would get those arrests the way I was trained to get those arrests was to be in transit rooms, and those doors in the subway that you don't know what they are, what they lead to. Many times they're restrooms for the transit employees, storage rooms for the custodial staff, etc. And we'd just be there peeking through the vent until someone jumps the turnstile. It was pathetic. And sometimes in the very station that we're hiding, people are being robbed, assaulted, real crime is happening, but we're away in a room hiding, waiting for someone to not pay $2.50.
Just because you needed the numbers, and those were sort of the low-hanging fruit, as it were, to get those numbers.
Yeah.
And
That's
so,
the best way to put it, the low-hanging fruit.
what like ultimately what became like your idea to address this type of stuff? I mean, you obviously feel, and we should also say you do make notice of, you know, when Bratton and Giuliani in the 90s were rolling out this whole broken windows policy, which was like sort of this version of, you know, we're going to get small time, we're going to respond to crime by getting small time arrests, and that will inhibit crime. It just so happened that there was a massive drop in crime, not just in New York City, but across the country. And I happen to subscribe to, you know, one theory about lead in the 20 years after lead gas is made illegal in a lot of these places. We see a drop in crime both internationally and nationally. But be that as it may, there was no evidence that their broken windows policy was the reason why there was this drop in crime. But what was your perspective on how policing could work? Like, if you were put in charge of reformation, can it happen by changing the cop culture, or does it have to happen from above?
Well, it's both. I think the way you change cop culture is what comes from above, because at the end of the day, people respond to what's incentivized, and it's the people above who can set those incentives. You know, it's funny because people who are against broken windows, those who are pro broken windows, always make it seem as if, you know, we think it should be a free for all, and that's not the case. It's just you don't have to address it with a sledgehammer. You understand? So we can still address those conditions, but there shouldn't be a number that cops are chasing, etc. Which is why one of the things that some police departments have that New York needs, and other places that want to focus on so-called quality of life offenses, we need an official warning system where, you know, you can give someone a warning. It's respected by ComStat, by the powers that be, as addressing the condition. But because it's recorded, if the person's behavior doesn't change for whatever the minor infraction is, then officers can make a decision as to whether or not they want to step up to actual enforcement. And that way, if there's any benefit to addressing minor things, we don't lose that. But at the same time, you're not destroying someone's life trajectory in the sake of numbers, because I can share many stories where that small arrests just derail people's lives completely, especially even summonses where, you know, not everyone has a job where you can afford the day to go write a summons or answer a summons. Yeah.
And so, I mean, would that be the biggest reform, that if you were, is just like a warning system as opposed to arrests for small crimes? I mean, what else would you, what else do you think needs to happen?
Several. So that's one, mainly because I realize so much of what aligns and becomes a George Floyd or a Eric Garner starts with the initial stop. Right? So much of reform, so much policy aims at, you know, making sure inmates are treated well, and it's just so far downstream. I want to get closer to the source of the issue, the initial stop. If the initial stop is rooted in an officer trying to meet a quota, it's terrible. And every now and then, Sam and Emma, everything comes into alignment and someone doesn't survive the situation. So that's why I started off with that. But one of the other things that's needed is implicit bias makes its way into policy, which is what leads to disparate outcomes when it comes to race and enforcement. I believe every police department needs a body of people that reviews policy and combs through it to make sure any type of implicit bias is eliminated. And what you need for that is You need civilians. You need people in the police department who are justice-minded. And you need people to oversee all these policies, because so many of my colleagues could not understand how systemic racism works and how policies from decades ago still affect the way we police today. If we scrub traditional policies and make sure incoming policies don't have implicit bias woven into the design, we will get much better outcomes when it comes to what happens with police. Metrics in terms of what we measure. If we only measure summonses, arrests, stop and frisk, and don't measure problem solving, again, these are all things that can be done to evolve policing into what it should be in the 21st century and beyond.
What's your perspective on Eric Adams, our mayor, putting aside the fact that he seems to be under investigation at the moment himself, but putting aside that, what I guess I'm most interested in, unless there's any other thoughts that you have, his election was very much focused on the idea that we were having this crime wave, and crime did go up significantly during COVID. It has also begun to drop significantly in the wake of sort of like more normalization. But what of and Adams made it like it was made it such a big deal that, people in, upstate New York were talking about like there's this crazy crime epidemic that's coming. And of course it never reached what it was when you were a kid in New York City. But what of the exploitation of crime as a political issue, and what does that do both to the cops and to the opportunity for reform?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the crime did rise during the pandemic, and it's a reality. There are different reasons as to why, but it's real. It's something that happened. While campaigning, the current mayor, he used that as part of his platform, especially because of his background as law enforcement, as to why he's the guy that has to lead the city out of the situation. The irony is that within a few months of his administration, he actually attacked media for reporting crime, right? Saying they're painting New York City in a particular light. It's like, this is the light that you used to say why you're the one folks should vote for. The mayor, I'm still very confused by the mayor, particularly because of his, not just his past as law enforcement, but specifically as an activist. This is something that a lot of people either don't know or have really forgotten about Mayor Adams. He started out as Officer Eric Adams, and he was one of the founding members of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. And honestly, the cop activist, he was the first, in his capacity. I remember as a kid watching him, at lecterns and podiums, speaking truth to power against the Giuliani administration. And I was actually somewhat inspired by that. He's been a mentor in the past, when I became a whistleblower. But unfortunately, that's not who I'm seeing right now. And I'm not understanding why. The person that I thought he would be when it comes to these issues is not what I'm seeing reflected for some reason.
Interesting. I don't know how much I was aware of that past, and I wonder how much that influenced people's perspective on what he was going to do once he got into office.
Yeah, he was an activist. He was the original activist cop. It was actually amazing to watch. My dad didn't speak English well, so I had to translate the news into Haitian Creole for him. And that's when I first got my first glimpse of Eric Adams at about 11 years old, translating the news for my dad.
When you look back on this and like on this, I guess ultimately 15 years more or less as a cop, and the suit, what I'm just curious is your overall perspective, like in terms of regrets or concerns, or like what, like where does this leave you?
It's a good question. Well, in terms of the mission, in terms of the objective, there have been victories. There's a lot more, because it's been incremental. So there's a lot more work that I want to do. In terms of regret, I don't regret it. there are things. This takes quite a toll on your personal life. I tell you that. So that's I'd probably make a few decisions differently there. But other than that, this is essential. This was needed. Think about it, Sam and Emma. During the pandemic, right, when we didn't even know if the world was going to continue, the one thing that remained constant was police brutality. Think about that. We don't even know. People are losing relatives, loved ones, friends at an alarming rate all around the world. No one knows what's about to happen. We're in an election year. But the one thing that was constant was Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. I mean, those are the folks that lost their lives. Imagine, but the police harassment continued. Here in New York, the police department were handing out masks in white areas. When the weather got warmer in May, going into June, they were handing out masks. But in black areas, they were using social distancing as a reason for that initial stop that I spoke about. The fact that people were congregating closely or not wearing masks was being used to search their pockets. You know, that the fact that in the middle of a pandemic that we can still count on police brutality, this is something that we have to continue to work towards. So I will never regret taking these steps in that sense. I just have a lot more work to do.
Are there places around the country where you've seen any type of reforms that came out of in the wake of the George Floyd protests where you think there's been meaningful reform?
Well, one of the things that we saw was definitely an increase in having more diverse leadership. But what that translates to, again, I will never fall for cosmetic diversity. I don't care what you look like, how you identify. If you're in a leadership position, I need to see what you're doing, you know, what those experiences cause your policies to look like. So I'm still, that's something I can't answer yet. I'm still analyzing it myself, but I'll definitely get back to you if there's any particular police department that I feel is starting to evolve in the right direction, especially in the wake of George Floyd.
Let me ask you one more question in that account. Is it what that you know, around the idea of just like sort of the cosmetic representation as opposed to genuinely representing a different mode of thought? When people of color and black people, brown people become in a position of authority within the police department, is it that they've been acculturated a certain way, or is it just simply from your perspective that the incentive structure is the same way? So, you know, a human being, if they're told their career depends upon ringing this bell 10 times, they're going to do it whether they have grown up in a system that has acculturated them to believe that they should bang that bell 10 times or not. I mean, if the incentive is when they're in the leader to bang it 10 times, that's what they're going to do. What do you, like, from your perspective, like what's going on with that?
Honestly, I'd say it's a combination. It starts off with what's incentivized, but then when you do it long enough and you don't challenge it, it becomes what you believe in. You know, it becomes what you think is essential. Especially if you're not the type of person that really tries to problem solve yourself. You kind of accept, you accept the reality that's presented to you, and it's coming from authority. You're indoctrinated into this paramilitary structure, so you're not challenging what you're being fed, you know. And before you know it, you rise to leadership and you perpetuate it, and it goes on. So it's a combination of both of those things. Because I remember there was an officer who he had just completed his degree in criminal justice at John Jay College. At the time, I was enrolled in John Jay, and I was very surprised and delighted to see that John Jay, the curriculum was not afraid to push the envelope and talk about, you know, the reality behind modern policing. But this officer was actually under investigation for a video that just gone viral. And when I pulled him aside, I said, you know, if you've completed your degree at John Jay, which I'm getting ready to do, and you have this information that I'm now reading, why do you police the way that you do? And his answer was as simple as it was so profound. He says, because I want to make it to the detective squad. It's just about what's incentivized. So your morals, your ethic, your personal morals, ethics, your perspective, even your politics all get suppressed because of what's incentivized. And then fortunately it starts to shift. your morals, your ethics, and your politics and your views. I know people who entered the police department liberal, and today they're the most conservative people I've ever met in my life. You know, yeah.
Edwin Raymond, the book is An Inconvenient Cop, My Fight to Change Policing in America, co-authored with Jon Sternfeld. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and within the podcast and YouTube descriptions. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Simon. Emma, I'll be back anytime if you need.
All right,
Thank
great.
you,
I
Edwin.
appreciate that, Edwin.